Amanda, I am so excited to talk to you about sourdough, for so many reasons. One, because I think you're absolutely lovely, but two, because sourdough is still this like enigma to me. I
It
have,
yes, it can be a little elusive and, kind of magical and fascinating in that way.
like instinctively, like grown up on Vancouver Island girl is like, yes, fermentation, sourdough. And I've been cooking for so long, but it's still been something that I'm like, I don't know if this is for me yet.
Yes, it takes a little while. It's like a process to get yourself to do it. It's like reading about it, learning about it, feeling comfortable, acquiring a starter, and then going.
Yeah. I for my when I had my first one of the books that was given to me was, I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's called Susie and the Sourdough Circus, and it's like
No,
this delightful children's book about Susie and her dad and how they make sourdough, and it like makes these little cartoon characters out of all the
I
little
love this.
sourdough. It's so awesome.
It
Like,
sounds so cute.
yeah. And then like my son was like, "Can we make sourdough?" I was like, "Ooh, mommy doesn't make sourdough."
Not yet, not yet.
Not yet, but maybe this conversation will change that for
Yes,
me. Did you
yes.
grow up like did you cook and bake a lot when you were little, or is this like something that happened new?
No, I mean, my grandma made homemade bread, and my mom would make, like, the frozen bread loaves that you just frozen
Yeah.
bread dough, and you make a loaf. And then, I started cooking more as I got into my own, basically, adult life. But we always ate dinner. My mom cooked a lot, not always from scratch, but we always had dinner together. So food is very much familial to me, and it's where I find myself happiest is in the kitchen. So
Yeah.
yeah. So and then I had never baked bread because I can't eat I can't eat gluten, which we'll get into. And so I think, as I now know so much more about sourdough, I almost think it helped that I hadn't made traditional bread because the process is different. And so I didn't know, I didn't have anything to compare it to. So it just felt like I was doing it hopefully right.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, so that all that to say that anybody can bake sourdough bread because I had never baked any type of bread in my entire life.
See, and that's what's not like, I feel like that's very important for people to hear. It's funny because growing up, like my grandmother always made like just she didn't make a lot of bread, but we're Portuguese, and like twice a year, my grandmother would make pão doce, which is just like this traditional sweetbread at Easter and Christmas. So I would like watch her get up at like 4 a.m. with like this
Yes.
massive metal tub and just like make like 20 loaves of this bread and then nothing. And then with me and my mom, it was, I think for a hot minute, we had a bread maker.
Yeah,
I don't
and
know.
so did we.
Yeah,
They
right?
were big in, like, the
The
90s.
90s? Yeah.
Late probably it was probably mid to late 90s. I mean, that was like the Instant Pot.
Yeah. The Instant Pot of the 90s
Yeah, it was that
before
craze.
people knew what gluten was or carbs were, and they were just
Yes.
like, "Yeah, of course you're gonna make your own bread."
Right. Right. Right.
You talked a little bit about being gluten sensitive, so you don't have celiac disease.
I do not have celiac disease, no. But I have been gluten-free for it's 12 years. Mine is more autoimmune related and comes out in skin issues for me and headaches, mainly psoriasis on different parts of my body and the really bad headaches. And so that happened, and I had a good friend who this was in like 2017. She had been making sourdough for a long time, and she would always make some for Brian, my husband. And she was like, I was just kind of doing some reading, and I actually read that, some people who are gluten sensitive actually don't have an issue eating sourdough bread because of the fermentation process. She's like, maybe you should try some. And I was like, why not? I know what's gonna happen to me. Like, I'm not damaging my stomach lining like I would be if I was celiac or something like that. So I know what's gonna happen to me, and if this could change, like, be a game changer for me, I'm willing to do it. So I tried it, and of course, it was, like, so incredibly delicious, and but I didn't wanna go overboard, since this is my first time having gluten in, probably 5 to 6 years, and, I felt great the next day, so I kinda ate a piece more each day, and then I actually went to Winnipeg, to Canada, for I was doing some photography for a tourism board there, and one of the places that I needed to photograph was this very, very old bakery, and the woman who, ran it, she was, like, 86 years old and had all of her bread was from sourdough starters, and she had, like, 8 of them, and so there were all these they had their own mill, and so they were milling the grains fresh, using these very old starters. And I thought, what the heck? Like, I'm sitting here with this woman breaking bread. Obviously going to eat it. And we'll see again. And again, I didn't have any issues. And so after that, I said, I'm learning how to do this because this is just so delicious. And I miss traditional bread, and I can make so many other things. And I'm just going to teach myself how to do it.
That's so cool. That's so funny, Winnipeg. Of
Yeah,
all the places, and for
of
people who
all
don't
the
know where
places.
Winnipeg is, it is essentially the geographical center from like east to west in Canada. And it's like, it's actually where Cereals Canada is too. So like the seat
Oh,
of like whole grains
whole
and like
grains, yes.
production is like Winnipeg because I went
Yeah,
there to like the Cereals Canada lab that just is totally an aside. But that's so funny because Winnipeg is not like, it's not some place that a lot of people like outside of Canada, like, no, they're like, "Winna what?"
yes, totally. Well, and being from, Minnesota, Wisconsin
It's
area, it's
close.
somewhere that I can actually drive to. It's 7 hours from here, so,
Oh, wow.
yeah. So it's not close, but
But close enough. If you can do it
close
between
enough.
breakfast and dinner, I feel like
Yes,
that's a yeah.
yeah, for sure. So after that, then I, got a starter from a friend, and I just slowly started learning and teaching myself, and, one of the books that I read and another Clever Carrot, Emily, she has written an amazing book on sourdough, and that's kind of was one of my starting bases too. And then, yeah, we live in an era where you can watch videos of many different things, and, so that was in late 2017, so I've been baking since then.
That's amazing, which is
Yeah.
honestly not that long considering when I think of your work, like, I think so much about sourdough and baking with you and thinking about the fact that, like, before 2017, you were just, like, fully gluten-free, which and I do a lot of gluten-free
Yeah,
baking, but it's, like, it's different, right? Like,
it's
it's
different.
very,
Yes,
very different.
it's very different. And I it's funny because the pandemic did also change things for me as far as the trajectory of my recipe development, which is what I do through my website, Heartbeat Kitchen. Beet is spelled like the vegetable. um, but had obviously developed some sourdough recipes, but when the pandemic hit, I was like, oh wow, people need these recipes and they want these recipes and they want to learn. And so it was really important for me to develop good recipes that beginners, again, most people had never even baked bread in their life, but they weren't going to the grocery store. And so they were trying to figure out how to make bread. And so it was really important for me to do it in a way that felt approachable and to know that you don't have to bake every single day. You can bake once a week if you want, once a month. Like it's very adaptable to your schedule. It's not this pet. The sourdough starter is not a pet that some people like to think that it is. I mean, yes, you have to keep it alive, but you don't need to feed it every single day.
It very much I think that's probably I always tell my kids because my kids keep, like, asking me almost every single day for a dog that I'm actually allergic to, but the thing I said, I was like, "Even if I wasn't allergic, I'm allergic to more responsibility," and I think that's,
Yes.
like, where my sourdough starter fear comes from. I was like, "I am allergic to more responsibility."
Yeah, and that's kind of also where I try to bust that myth of that it's it's so much babysitting. And really, I mean, I teach classes here at my house, and a lot of these people are just baking once a week, and we go through the schedule so that they can bake every Sunday and then put their starter in the fridge and they're good, and then they feed it a couple times before they bake again, but it's very or if they need to go on vacation, we go through that process, and it will stay alive. It's very resilient.
Okay, so once you have a sourdough starter then because you got it from a friend or
Yes.
you made your own, so then you keep it in the fridge and how often do you feed it?
Right, so if you're keeping it on the counter, if you're baking a lot, you're gonna be feeding it once a day, and you'll discard some of it, which means you'll just take some of it out because at the base level, what a sourdough starter is flour and water that are mixed together and they capture wild yeast in the air. And when the wild yeast eats the flour and the water, that creates CO2, which is gas, and makes your bread rise and the starter rise. And so when you go to feed it, you have to discard quite a bit of it to get that. It's just kind of dead weight. It's not going to make bread rise anymore, but you can still use it for other applications in baking. But yeah, so you would feed it once a day. Now, if you're keeping it in the fridge, you want to feed it before you put it in the fridge so it has some food. And then you like to take it out about 2 days before you plan on mixing your dough so that you can go through two feeding cycles to wake it back up. And the thing about yeast and fermentation is that it succeeds in a warm environment. So cold basically halts that fermentation, which you'll use to your advantage in the fridge. Because if it's sat on the counter in a warm spot or just even room temperature, it's going to keep fermenting and it goes through all of its food and then it will die if you leave it go too long.
And I'm always so fascinated by the process of fermentation and I love how simply you described it. It's just the idea of the wild yeast taking that food from the flour and creating the CO2. But
Yeah,
the fermentation then, while when we're eating sourdough bread, it's no longer a live ferment. Like we've baked it. There are
right.
no living microbes in it. But when we are ferment, how long do you ferment your loaves before you bake them?
Usually it's like a 20 to 24 hours of fermentation. Because also what you can do, and this is how I help people build it into their schedule, is that you can time it so that the final rise is overnight in the fridge, and then you can bake it anytime the next day, and that also helps get more basically nutrition and flavor into the loaf because it creates a different type of acid than when it's warm. So, there's 2 types of acid. The acetic acid is what makes it sour, and the lactic acid is what makes it, like, creamy. So, when it's in the cold temperatures, it gives off more acetic acid, so it's got that tang, which we all love sourdough for. But yeah, and what's fascinating too, like you said about eating it, is relates to the gluten thing in that the fermentation process, there have been studies on it, is what breaks down certain proteins and certain carbohydrates in the bread. And so that makes it a lot easier for people to digest. It doesn't completely, because gluten is a protein, it's not the wheat, it's not anything else, it is an actual protein. And so the longer it ferments, the more it eats and breaks down those gluten proteins. And then the same thing with the carbohydrates. You probably know a lot about FODMAPs, and those are some of the proteins and things that it breaks down that also makes it easier to digest.
Yeah, and I love how you broke that down too, because and it's important. Like I feel like the dietitian needs to be like PSA if you have celiac disease, this
Yes.
is not the process for you
Yep.
because there is still gluten present in the food. But for people who have a non-celiac gluten
Yep.
sensitivity or an intolerance that's related to another health condition, this becomes really interesting, particularly, for me and my clients with irritable bowel syndrome who
Yes.
find that certain FODMAPs, so those fermentable like here starts to bring it all together, like the fermentable carbohydrates, what's
Yep.
fermenting the yeast and the lactic acid
Yes.
bacteria. But we know that a properly fermented sourdough, so not like a quick little ferment, but like a properly fermented sourdough breaks down fructans in wheat.
Yes. That's
And
exactly right.
yeah, so the longer you can ferment that dough, the more that fructan is being broken down. And for people who are fructan sensitive, if you've got IBS, that's another, person for whom it's sourdough, like a proper sourdough might be such a great choice.
Right. Which is, to that point too, you really have to know, like for me, you can't buy grocery store sourdough because that is often injected with a flavoring that tastes like sourdough or uses a very small amount of traditional sourdough starter, and then the rest is supplemented by commercial yeast. And so they don't have to, wait for it to ferment and rise and all those things. They can just bake it right away. And that would not be good for me to eat. So that's also why I really wanted to learn so that I could trust what I was eating. And there are now, even more since 2020, more sourdough exclusive bakeries popping up. And so, and those, all you have to do is ask them, is the only leavener in here the sourdough starter? And that, that will answer your question. But yeah, it's been honestly life changing. So,
Yeah. And I think, I think it really speaks to, like, as a dietitian, it's not something I take for granted, but something that's a part of my day to day. And I think for people who don't have any reactions to or medical needs that sort of like change the way they need to eat in order to feel well, you can forget how transformative it is to get a certain food back. If you're like, "Oh,
yeah.
wow, like this food doesn't feel well or it makes my condition worse." Having to
Mhm.
say goodbye to a certain food is really challenging, and a lot of people with celiac disease, with type 2 diabetes, they experience a real grieving process, and
Yeah.
one of the things that's so incredible about something like this, like, you were gluten-free for so long, and you're like,
So long.
"Wow, like, I get all of the baked things back."
Oh, I mean, I literally nearly cried when I made sourdough English muffins for the first time and was I couldn't even believe how good it tastes, and the texture. It's almost more the textural component that you can't get in gluten-free. It's just not the same. There are a lot of really good things that you can substitute and use, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
And, and I think that if you can and once you try it, I think then it's easier to prioritize, like, learning it because 'cause
Yeah.
you're like, "Okay, I just don't wanna live without this."
Once I'm like, I need to have this deliciousness all of the time,
Yes.
therefore I need a steady supply. And,
Yeah.
it's funny because you mentioned the pandemic. And again, sort of like my dietitian brain, it was so interesting because we're just like the internet is so diety and it's always
Yeah.
goes by another guise, another name, but it's still so diety. And then when the world felt like it was falling apart, like all of a sudden,
Yep.
everyone was baking.
Yes.
Like, it was banana bread, it was sourdough bread, and I think it speaks to the very comforting and healing nature of food itself, but I also think it's the process of cooking.
Yes, and for me, that was one thing that I found so helpful and unexpectedly. It is such a therapeutic process for me to use my hands in a way that does not use many ingredients and creates this beautiful, nourishing loaf of bread that, yes, can feed several people. And that is something that is so satisfying, I think, as just a human. And also in knowing, I think for me, to slow down and learn something as a hobby, not a recipe, because there are things that change with sourdough every time you bake because of the environment. Your home is never going to be the same temperature. Your dough is going to be different temperatures. The water you might use is different. And so you really are learning a process, and you're learning how something feels and looks and guiding with your intuition. And there are very few things we do anymore that are that way.
Yeah, it's almost the opposite, right? Our world is set up to disconnect us from
Yes.
intuition, to disconnect us from like our physical embodied self and just keep us like in our mind, like consuming, consuming, consuming. And when you said how sourdough is a process, I remember like when I think about my grandmother, like she had no recipes written down, right? Because same thing,
Yeah.
yeah, like it's a little bit colder today, it's a little bit damper today. The dough
Yes.
looks like this and it should look like
Right.
this. So she changes things like it to give yourself it's that relationship
It
with
totally is
something.
that. And almost, I mean, for me, it challenged perfectionism too, because
Mm,
you can do the same thing, the next day that you just baked an amazing bread, and something will just be different and it doesn't look the same. And and it's just, that's the way it is. It's like snowflakes. There's never the same that comes down. It's always different. And so you can get good at it and be able to predict things, but it really kind of also has a mind of its own.
is that something that you've struggled with, that idea of perfectionism and
Yes,
yeah.
definitely. I my whole life, and anxiety too, and this has been a way for me to really kind of let go of some of those hard and fast rules, and for me, the hands-on movement is also very helpful for my anxiety, because it's channeling this energy towards something else that's positive and taking me kind of out of those thoughts. And knowing that it's not instant, like this is going to take me a while, this will keep me busy, and then the end result will be very delicious.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's, and I that seems to be also what was probably helpful for a lot of people during the really hard times of COVID, because anxiety did rise. People's stress levels rose tons, and you were secluded, and
Mhm.
with your own thoughts, and you needed something to do with them. So,
Yeah.
I encourage people that it can be more than just how it tastes, but the whole act of making it is very therapeutic.
Yeah, and I think we joke about the notion of therapy baking, but I think, there are so many professionals now talking about that sort of like very embodied work. And like this is like in real time, it's tactile.
Yeah,
It's, like you can't be doing that and scrolling on your phone, for example. Like you have to
right.
be very much in the moment and experiencing like that feedback that you're getting from the
Yeah,
process.
yeah. That's a really good way to describe it, is the feedback that the dough is giving you.
Yeah. So how does one cultivate that? I mean, asking for a friend, but,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I so I've taught a lot through like Instagram videos, YouTube, and my website. And I really think that, like I said, the first thing is acquiring the starter. And I sell mine on my website, and it's $12 shipped anywhere in the world. Yeah, I have shipped, I think, to over like 27 countries. So
what?
that's really fun. And it's the same price no matter where you live, because I just really think that that gift of sharing with others, and having it be in all different pockets of the world, is a really cool thing. But it's much easier to get a mature starter from someone and get going than it is to build your own. So I highly recommend that. You'll be baking much faster and have a much greater success rate, just because it has so much strength if it's been cared for properly. And then, like my everyday sourdough recipe is made for the beginner. And so there are videos of each step in the recipe so you know what the dough should look and feel like. And it's one of those things as a recipe developer where the recipe looks long, but it's that way because I try to put as many details about how it should look and feel and smell in there to make you successful. And then it's really about just practicing. It's like any other hobby where the more you do it, the more you'll learn the feedback that it's giving you. And I truly think that half the battle is just starting. Is just literally starting and jumping in because that is the best way to learn. It's when you can't touch it, if you're just watching all the time, you can't really experience quite what the person means. And so you'll have loaves that aren't great, but they're still homemade bread. And
I I think that's the thing, your fails are still
they're
delicious.
still delicious, and slather on some butter and some flaky salt, and all is right.
Yeah.
And I tell people too, what's what I wish I would have known when I started was make the same recipe at least 8 to 10 times before you deviate to another recipe, because those things like temperature do change every time you bake. So if you don't get the same result, you at least know the recipe was the same and other things could have changed in there. So that's one thing that I think is really important too, just sticking with it.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I think the first thing that came into my mind in this moment was like, "Can you please tell everyone on the internet that when you, like, put out a recipe and they're like, 'I changed this and this and this and this, and it didn't work. This is a terrible recipe.'"
Yes, I know. I know. It's one of those things, but I love seeing people's progression too, because you can just see when the light starts to click, when they really start to get it, and just the joy of baking your own bread is there's very few things that excite me more. And, like you were talking, like there's so many other things you can make with it too.
Mhm.
And that's what's been so wonderful is like the sourdough English muffins, the focaccia, the pizza. I mean, it just opens up this whole world of possibilities.
Well, and this idea of sort of being more self-sustaining, I think that myself included, like, when I say all the time, like, I'm not a skilled person in air
Mhm.
quotes, and people are like, "Well, what do you're like a dietitian." I'm like, "Yeah, but I don't have, like, the skills. Like, me in the zombie apocalypse, I'm gonna be a drain on resources. Like, I'm not helping you out. I don't know how to, like, build things with the only thing that I can do is cook." But there is, I think, when you can bake something like bread that's just such a staple, it does feel like, "Wow. Okay, so,
Yeah.
like, there's, like, one tick box on the zombie apocalypse, like,
Yes.
checklist for me. I can bake my own bread, so I will stay alive and I will feed other people."
Yeah, and that was too when I started baking. I was like, wow, like it can feed a lot of people and it's very shareable and you can make a lot of meals from a loaf, it's very versatile. And I had never thought of anything else like that in my,
Mhm.
gardening, yes, but not
Yeah.
something that I've baked. So, and for me too, going back a little bit to the gluten thing, and just being able to eat this has I don't think what I'm trying to say, my body is happier eating carbohydrates, and I don't think I could find enough of them that were satisfying when I was completely gluten-free, and so I especially, like, my energy levels, I felt like once I was able to eat more carbohydrates that tasted good to me, then I wanted to eat more of them, and it really helped my body feel better.
Yeah. I feel like I want you to, like, shout that one from the rooftops because there is such and I think this is where the opportunity around sourdough is for also a lot of people who maybe because of things that they've heard or because of their own relationship with, like, symptoms and foods in the past, the idea that you can feel safer with
Yeah.
food and trust
Yes.
because here you were not being able to eat gluten and avoiding these things. And you're like, oh, wow, if there's a way of preparing this, I can eat all of these foods. And while they're nourishing my body in a way
Yes.
that maybe I didn't think they could before, because they're
Yeah.
nourishing foods.
They're nourishing foods, and, I it's funny too because I often get asked, like, "Well, you make a lot of bread, and it's just you and Brian. Do you guys eat all that bread?" And I'm like, "Yeah, we do." Sometimes when I'm teaching classes and I have, 5 loaves going, I share them with the neighbors, but most of the time when I'm baking, it's for us, and yes, I do. We eat it.
Yeah, because we've gotten so turned around when it comes to like what are the foods that we eat for a healthy body, and for some reason, I mean, I know the reasons because I see it every day, that like bread has been struck off that list, but wheat is a staple of our civilization. Like it's not just us in North America. People are like, oh well, North American food versus, like, we're talking like
Yeah.
this is an ancient food consumed around the world. Like we were
Yes.
designed to eat this stuff.
Right, and I think that's what's really cool too is so many, ancient grains and are being grown now closer to us that we're able to bake sourdough with some of these really unique, nutritious whole grains like einkorn and red fife, and, I mean, there's just spelt. I mean, all these different ones that we now have access to, and, Flourist in Canada is one of my favorite sources for all of their amazingly milled, fresh whole grain flours.
Yeah, I love Shira, I love Flowerist. I will make sure that I link them in the show notes because what they're
Oh, they're
doing
so
is like
great. It's
super,
amazing.
super cool. It is
Yeah,
amazing.
it's amazing. I love them, and I love their flour.
I want to talk to you a little bit about your blog and the work that you do, because I think a lot of people have come to you for your sourdough. And I always love, especially because in this world too, I love hearing from bloggers and like how you got started. Like,
Mhm.
was it just something like, what was the sort of spark? You're like, I'm going to start up a blog and do this stuff.
And it relates to this story because I started my blog in 2011 because I had to go gluten free. And I was like, I really love to write. And I was like, I'm just going to like kind of journal how this is going for me. And, I bought a domain and had never picked up a camera in my entire life. And I just kind of started writing about it, talking about it, working on these recipes because it made me happy to be able to like make something that I thought tasted good, even though I was completely changing the way that I had to eat. And at that time, I was in a very stressful medical device job selling medical device equipment. And I was just so turned off also by the entire industry. And I was having more thoughtful conversations at the farmers market with the farmers and the makers. And I just decided, you know what, I've got to get out of this. I need to find something else. And so I went back to my original marketing degree. So I'm now at a wine bar, like, serving and also helping their event planning and learning more about wine and food while I'm writing my blog. And then I went to Target Corporation and I worked there for 3 years. And then finally, I had enough clients from, sponsorships and the food photography side of things that I went on my own in 2015. And yeah, and that's how Heartbeat Kitchen became started what it is today.
And it started out as a totally gluten-free
Yes.
blog and then like
Started out, and it's really interesting because I do have such a passion for developing gluten-free baked goods that are developed well, taste good, texture-wise, you'd never be able to know they're gluten-free because there are so many bad gluten-free things out there, and it makes me sad because that's what people think they all have to be like, and I'm just like, "No, you can really make things that are excellent, but it takes a lot of recipe testing to do so. And it doesn't mean it has to be complicated for the end user, for whoever is making a recipe of mine in their home, but it takes the work on my end, which I love doing. So,
It's yeah, I feel like we could compare notes, especially because I'm not what I would consider to be like a capital B baker. Like I'm like a cookies and
yes.
muffins kind of girl,
Yeah.
but a lot of my work because our client base has always been like lots of people with celiac disease and
Mhm.
so like I do a lot of gluten-free baking and the
Yes.
fails
Oh,
are
they're
so epic. They're epic.
yes. Oh, they're yeah, it's, and the funny part is, like, sometimes you find bakeries selling those fails and just like, "This is all we can do," and I just wanna scream, "No, it's not. Let me help you. Let me help you."
Yeah, I've had muffins that like refuse to bake. Like
Oh, yeah.
45 minutes in, 60, I was like, "They're still molten, like, how did that happen?" And I
Yeah, how
think
did
for
that
me too,
happen?
because I'm also vegan, so there's no
That's
eggs and it's
that
low
is
in
one
sugar. Oh,
yeah.
it's the trifecta of, like, let's make this as difficult to succeed
That
as
sounds
possible.
very difficult. Yeah. But yeah, so, and then so now it's a combination of gluten-free baked goods and then like real modern food recipes that are comforting, are foods that I kind of grew up with, but made in a way that is more modern and more real food centered. And then obviously all the sourdough recipes.
Mm. And what would you say to someone who is like interested in starting a blog? Because I always love hearing from successful bloggers, especially because I feel like I'm still in the beginning phase. Every time I think I know something, I was like, "Oh, I
Oh,
had no idea. That cost me years." Like what would you if someone was like, "I love food and I want to share my stories and I want to start a blog." Like what are a couple of tips that you would give to newbies given that you've had so much
yeah.
experience?
I think one of the biggest things when you're starting is, I mean, many of us, and I don't know if this is the same for you, but I didn't start it with the goal of it being my career. It was like we talk about sour, it was a hobby. It was something that I could put my energy towards that I felt really good about. And that's what I would suggest that people do when they're first starting because you don't know if it's something that you're truly going to enjoy. And if you treat it like you really want to make it something right at first, I think that a lot of people burn out and they get too involved in all of the small little things about blogging that they really don't matter until a certain point. So I would say find what it is that you really want to write about, talk about, photograph, all those kinds of things, and have fun and do it. And then once you've done it for a while and you're like, yeah, I think this is kind of it, then I suggest, really getting your ducks in a row with someone who knows search engine optimization to help you get a website together that can actually be found on the internet. Because I did not know that. It took me a long time to get to that point, which, like you said, I lost, whatever on that, years on that. And so I wish I would have known that sooner to get off on the right foot and to be able to build that. It's never going to be quick, but you're going to be one step ahead if you start that way. And so there are, a lot of people that do website development who specialize in those kinds of things. And it's worth the investment if you do decide this is the route I want to go.
Amazing. Is there anyone on your Rolodex that you would suggest to people? Like I used Per Design for my website and I loved them.
Yes, I used Made to Thrive, and they
Mm.
were also excellent. Women, and Per is also a women, and I think that just really helps, especially with food or diet, anything that's, you know, you want it to feel like you. I just feel like is able to be created when someone kind of gets how you're feeling, and that's how I really felt with Made to Thrive too.
That's amazing. Yeah, the whole idea of just because you put something on the internet doesn't mean people will see it shocked me. Like
Yeah,
I was like, I've been
yeah.
writing this blog for like I don't know, like 6 years. And they're like, nobody on the internet is seeing your
Yes,
blog.
no one can find it and nobody knows except you.
Yeah, don't do a Squarespace, folks.
And
Just
do
word
not
to
do
the
a
wise.
Squarespace. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so those are the things that I think are really helpful. And the third thing I would say is find a few people, I mean now with the internet, that are like in similar starting points as you, and just kind of make friends with them, and so that you can bounce ideas off of each other and help each other, because I really feel like having a peer who understands and who is going through the same thing is also really valuable.
Yeah, I love that. And it is such a unique world. Like there's a
Yes.
lot of things in blogging or even just, spending your time in content creation that like don't make sense to like normal
No.
everyday business folks. Like you have to do
No.
what and the
And
what?
sometimes
And
they
like,
don't even make sense to me. I'm just
yeah.
like, "Why are we doing this?" Yeah.
Yeah, teach it to me like I'm 3 because
Yes.
this is the level you need to talk to me.
Right. Right. But it can be a very, I mean, I love what I do because of the people. I
Yeah.
love what I do because of the people who have learned to do something that they didn't think that they could do, who have a recipe of mine, on their table at night, who send me an instant message, a direct message showing me what they baked. I mean, it's just really a satisfying thing that I love.
Yeah, well, and it's this deep connection, right? Between us all, where when one of your recipes is made in someone else's kitchen, you're like, that's like a tiny little piece of me that's
Yes.
in your life.
It's which is also why I have the nervous Nelly when someone also tells me, because 'cause I'm like, "Oh my god, I hope it turned out right for you,
Oh
and I
my god,
hope,"
I know.
and people are like, "You still think that way after you've been," I'm like, "Yes. I don't care how long you've been doing this, you just really, because you appreciate so much that they, like, trusted you and took that recipe and made it for their family or for just themselves, whatever it may be, and you just want it to be how you intended."
Yeah, my kids keep me real humble because they appear to hate 96% of everything that I make. And so when someone else is like, I loved your recipe, or my kids, my 5-year-old, love this recipe. I was like, can your 5-year-old talk to my 8-year-old and maybe they can like set
Can they
something up?
hang out
Yeah.
and transfer taste buds?
Yeah, please. But this is maybe a really good point to bring up. Sometimes things don't work, and particularly around sourdough, because like you said, you can do the same thing and get a different result. Like, can we talk about like a little troubleshooting
Yeah.
if you're like,
Mhm.
what did I do here?
Yeah, and the other thing that I would say is one thing that I wish someone would have told me when I started is there so getting the proofing right is probably what I would say the hardest part of sourdough, and the part that takes the longest time to, like, learn when it's right to move to the next step. And most recipes or most instruction will tell you, you have your dough in a bowl, and that's when you're doing the stretch and fold, and that's what it ferments in. But with a bowl, you can't tell how much it's rising because it grows outwards and up rather than straight up. And so they make, just it's basically restaurant style, like food grade buckets that have volume lines on them. And so after you're done doing your stretch and folds, you'll transfer it then into this tall sided bucket so that you can actually gauge how much your dough is rising. And I feel like that is one troubleshooting tip that I just wish that I would have learned, because you're always then guessing how much did it actually rise when it's just in a bowl. Um,
That's
so
maybe
that is
life
one.
changing.
Yeah, I didn't learn it till like 4 years in, and I just, and so the chances of you getting the proofing right just increase just insanely because you actually have a gauge now. So that's one thing. The other troubleshooting is I have a post on my website that's like the top 5 sourdough starter tips. And there are 2 signs. or two ways to tell kind of like if your starter doesn't seem like it's behaving correctly, and it has to do with texture. But if it's really runny, like yogurt, and it has a lot of small, tiny bubbles, and it smells like nail polish remover, that's usually it means it's hungry and it hasn't been fed enough. Because what happens when the yeast is starved is it gives off alcohol, and so that's why it's smelling so weird and getting all those the thin texture. And then if it's not rising and it's just like really kind of thick, it's not airy, it's just stagnant kind of, it's usually too cold in your home, which so that often happens in the winter, and people will be like, my starter's not rising, did it die, da da da. And usually it's just that it's too cold in our homes in the winter. So one way to troubleshoot that is by using your oven with the light on but the oven off, and then that keeps an ambient temperature of like, you know, 80 degrees, and that way your starter is in an environment to keep it really happy.
Okay. Yeah. My
So
house, especially because I have this old house with zero insulation in the walls. And it's a
yeah.
good thing that I don't live somewhere like Winnipeg because we would not survive the winter.
Yeah, yeah, that's how it is here. Our house, this is a 1908 house, and so it's set. It'll say it's 70 in here, and it definitely is not. So yeah, so those are some like two very easy troubleshooting. But like I said, on my website, there's a really good resource sheet too.
Okay. Okay, we'll make sure to link it in the show notes so that people
Awesome.
can study up
Yes.
before the mistake happens so they can
Yes.
recognize it.
Yes. Yeah.
I feel like this is the perfect point to shift into the rapid fire questions. So
Let's do
we
it.
close every episode with a few little fun softballs, getting to know you type things. So first one is favorite weeknight dinner.
Ooh, favorite weeknight dinner is definitely a rice bowl. Usually with like a salt and pepper tofu, and then kind of a spicy kind of like sriracha mayo sauce and some roasted veggies. That is just my go-to often. And then when I'm feeling less inspired, my other go-to is a grilled cheese on sourdough with Gouda and white cheddar.
Amazing. Yeah, if you got all
Yeah.
that good bread in the house.
Yes. Yes. Gotta use it.
Okay, next one. Sweet or savory? You can only pick one.
Oh,
I know it's mean.
savory. Yeah.
The condiment you can't live without.
Ooh, mayonnaise. And
Mayo
mayonnaise
is
also,
life.
it also gets so much hate, and I'm just like, you guys, you do not know how magical it is and how many things you can use it in and how much it makes sauces taste delicious.
I cannot live without it. It is my
No.
number one
Yes. Okay,
condiment.
I love this. We are friends. Not
We're
that we
mayo
weren't
buddies.
before, but we are we are really friends.
Vanilla or chocolate?
Vanilla,
Okay.
1000%.
And then what do you do to unwind that's not baking?
I watch really ridiculous reality TV shows like Real Housewives, Love is Blind, any reality love show, I'm probably watching. Also, I'm probably petting cats. I have 4 cats. I love my cats. I foster cats and then have four of my own.
It's amazing. What's your favorite Real Housewives?
Beverly Hills.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Yep. Yep. So,
I think we need some watch. I'm very much that person who loves to watch cerebral stuff, but there is
yeah.
something to be said for just completely checking out and like
It just
soaking up the drama.
my husband does not understand it. He thinks I'm so crazy for watching it and that it is just it is just awful TV, and I'm like it is. And
That's the point.
that's the point. And for him, it's like sci-fi shows that I think are absolutely ridiculous. That's what he uses to wind down. And I'm like, "See? We don't need to agree on this.
Totally. I
You
don't
watch, I will watch."
I don't need to watch guys in tights
No,
crashing into each other in a large
no,
field and
no,
vice
I
versa.
don't.
Amanda, thank you so much
Thank you
for
so much for having me.
welcoming us into your world and teaching us a little bit more about sourdough. I promise you, by the time this episode airs, I'm going to do
I
it.
know, I'm gonna send you one. I'm gonna send you a starter.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll
I'm going
send
to
it
do it.
to
I'm going to
you.
make it happen.
Yeah, I'll send that to you, and if, people have questions too, my DMs are always open, and it's super important for me to answer to people, so I'm happy to help.
That's so amazing. I know
Yeah,
how much work that is. So we really
yeah.
appreciate it.
Yes. Awesome.